You know that moment, when something that should have felt magical instead lands in your chest like a punch wrapped in velvet. That was me, sitting in a plastic folding chair positioned awkwardly near the coat racks, straining to hear the wedding music through a closed set of French doors, the muffled joy of my sister's big day just out of reach. If weddings are supposed to make you feel like part of something bigger, like a woven thread in the fabric of family, then I was the one thread someone forgot to tie in. It wasn't even just that I was seated far away, as if my presence were a last-minute afterthought. It was that I had asked. Not demanded, not even assumed. I simply asked my sister where I should sit, assuming I'd be among family. Her smirk in response was like something from a high school cafeteria, petty and biting. "Oh," she said, tilting her head with exaggerated sympathy, "we've got a spot for you. Just outside. Near the coats. Hope you don't mind standing during the ceremony." She said it loud enough for her friends to hear, and a few of them actually laughed. I don't know what cut deeper, her words or their amused glances, as if I were some cautionary tale. My name is Isabel, and that day I was not the beloved sister of the bride. I wasn't even a guest of honor or a family member held at arm's length with a sense of reluctant grace. I was simply someone my sister had decided didn't count anymore, and she wanted to make sure I knew it. The ceremony was held in this rustic chic venue that my sister, Marissa, had gushed about for months. Barn-style doors, mason jars with fairy lights, endless wood-paneled charm. It was like Pinterest had come to life in upstate Vermont. Everything was artfully curated, down to the vintage typewriter where guests could leave a love note to the couple. But behind the distressed wood and wildflower bouquets was something colder. And I felt it in the seat assignment, the side eyes, and that smirk that told me this wasn't just an oversight. This was intentional. I stared down at the beautifully wrapped wedding gift in my lap, an antique silver tea set that once belonged to our grandmother. Marissa and I used to play tea party with it when we were little, our bare knees pressed into the itchy carpet of our childhood home, tiny cups clinking as we giggled and pretended to be queens. It was the one gift I had poured emotion into, wrapping each fragile piece in tissue paper lined with lavender sachets because our grandmother always smelled faintly of lavender and lemon cookies. It was supposed to be something meaningful. Something that said, "You matter to me, even when you forget that I matter too." But now, sitting by the coat racks, it felt ridiculous, like I was still trying to buy my way into a relationship that had been declining for years. You know those slow fades in siblinghood, where texts go unanswered for longer stretches, where birthday calls become birthday texts and then nothing at all. That had been us. But I held out hope that a wedding might be the kind of event that bridged old gaps. I was wrong. As guests filtered past me toward the ceremony, no one made eye contact. It was like being a ghost at your own family function. One aunt gave me a stiff smile before slipping into the main room, and a cousin nodded so quickly it looked more like a neck spasm than a greeting. No one asked why I was sitting where the ushers put the lost umbrellas. No one invited me to join them. That was the part that stayed with me the most later, not the location of the chair itself, but the way people quietly agreed that that's where I belonged. I remember standing up. Not in anger. Not in a flourish. Just quietly. I held the tea set with both hands, careful not to crack the lid of the sugar bowl, and I walked out the same door I'd come in. No scene. No dramatic speech. Just steps. My heels clicking on the polished floor, echoing behind me like a series of questions I already knew the answers to. I got in my car and drove away without turning on the radio, the only sound being the shallow rhythm of my breathing and the occasional rattle of the wrapped box in the passenger seat. It wasn't until the next morning that the truth started dripping in. Apparently, people noticed. Not everyone, of course, because the bride had made sure I wasn't exactly in the spotlight. But someone had seen the chair placement, someone had overheard her remark, someone had watched me walk out with the gift still in hand. And by the time brunch rolled around the next day, when guests gathered at the same venue for a farewell breakfast, my absence had become a conversation topic no one could quite ignore. My cousin Melanie texted me around noon. "Hey, just wondering, are you okay? You left kinda suddenly yesterday." I didn't answer right away. What could I even say? That I had been assigned a seat near damp parkas and guests' forgotten gloves? That my sister had made it clear I wasn't part of the inner circle? But the second message came quickly. Also, did you hear what happened? She went pale after Aunt Jo cornered her about your seating. Apparently, Jo made a comment about it in front of a whole table. Something like, did you forget your own sister? Marissa didn't know you had taken the gift with you. When she realized, she just froze. Totally pale. Walked away from the table. Left her mimosa untouched. I stared at the message for a long time. That part, the mimosa, it felt so absurdly specific, and yet it grounded the moment in a strange reality. I imagined Marissa, in her custom gown, standing there with her champagne glass, suddenly realizing that maybe, just maybe, she'd pushed me too far. That maybe I had finally stopped playing the role of the quiet, accommodating sister. That maybe the gift I had taken back was the first time I had ever taken anything back at all. And I wondered what frightened her more, the realization that I had walked away, or the possibility that this time, I wouldn't come back. It's strange how quiet a house can feel when you return to it after a moment like that, after your own sister silently declared you irrelevant and the walls of family obligation came crashing down in a single smirk. When I got back to my place, I didn't kick off my shoes or drop the keys in the bowl by the door like I usually did. Instead, I stood in the entryway, still holding the gift box, the silver tea set wrapped in tissue and carefully tied ribbon, a symbol of something that had once meant everything and now felt like a relic from a version of me that no longer existed. I placed it gently on the kitchen counter, as if the act of setting it down might also allow me to let go of what had happened. But of course, it didn't. That's the thing about family. You carry their voices with you long after the room has emptied, long after the music has stopped, long after the guests have clinked glasses and posed for smiling photos that hide more than they reveal. That evening, I didn't answer any of the texts that started trickling in. Melanie again, then Aunt Jo, even a message from my cousin Clara who never involved herself in drama and had probably sent it more out of protocol than true concern. The texts all had that same tone, that curious mixture of faux concern and morbid curiosity, like they couldn't decide whether they were checking on me or just angling for gossip to fuel their next brunch. By morning, I was still simmering. Not with rage, but with that quieter, heavier kind of disappointment that you only feel when someone you love forgets how to love you back. I made tea in my kitchen, ordinary tea, not the special kind I'd once imagined Marissa and I sharing as sisters reminiscing about our childhoods, and sat with my back to the window, letting the sunlight hit the floor in streaks that reminded me of church pews and broken promises. Then came the call I hadn't expected, my mother. She never called casually. She was a texter, a leave a voicemail if it's really important kind of woman. So when I saw her name on the screen, I hesitated before answering. My thumb hovered. I was tempted to let it go to voicemail like always, but something in me was curious. I wanted to hear what version of the story she was going to spin. Isabel, she began, and even from that single word, I could hear it, the breathlessness, the attempt at restraint, the effort to sound concerned without admitting wrongdoing. I just wanted to check in. I heard you left the wedding a little early. A little early. That was the phrase she went with. Not invisible to your own family. Not banished to the coat racks. Not publicly humiliated in front of extended relatives and near strangers. No, just a little early, as if I had left during dessert instead of before the ceremony even began. I didn't answer right away. I wanted to see how far she'd go before acknowledging what had happened. It's just, she continued, now clearly uncomfortable, Marissa's feeling a bit shaken. She didn't realize you were upset. You know how weddings are, so much happening at once, things get lost in the shuffle. There it was. The classic family strategy. When someone hurts you, they don't apologize, they blame logistics. They act as if emotions are paperwork that went missing in the chaos. I exhaled slowly, trying to keep my voice even. She told me I didn't count, Mom. She said it right to my face. She pointed to a seat by the coat racks and smirked like it was a joke we could all laugh about. But I wasn't laughing. There was a pause, and I could hear her breathing, as if she were trying to formulate the safest response. "Well, she's your sister," she said finally. "You know how she can be. Sometimes she speaks without thinking." But she didn't mean any harm. That was the moment something inside me broke, not in a dramatic way, but in that quiet final way a rope snaps after years of being pulled too tight. "No, Mom," I said, and I felt my throat tighten as I spoke. She did mean it. She meant to make me feel small, and she succeeded. And now that she's realizing people noticed, now that she's embarrassed, she's pretending it was a misunderstanding. But it wasn't. My mother sighed, a sound I had heard my entire life whenever I said something that made her uncomfortable. I was the truth-teller in a family that preferred fiction. I was the mirror in a house that never wanted to see itself clearly. "Well," she said, the word stretched and hesitant, "you should come by later this week. We're doing a little family dinner to celebrate the newlyweds. I think it would be good for everyone if you showed up. Maybe bring that gift with you." I laughed then, not because anything was funny, but because it was so absurd that I couldn't help it. "You want me to come to dinner and act like nothing happened? Like I wasn't treated like background noise at my own sister's wedding? And you want me to bring the gift, the one I took back because it didn't feel right to give it anymore?" Her voice sharpened. "Isabel, don't be dramatic." That word again. Dramatic. Always the label they slapped on any emotion that made them uncomfortable. It was easier to call me dramatic than to admit that Marissa had been cruel. It was easier to pretend I was fragile than to face the truth that I was finally, painfully, seeing them all clearly. I ended the call without another word. That night, I took the tea set out of the box. I unwrapped each piece slowly, carefully placing them on a shelf in my dining room. Not because I wanted to keep them hidden forever, but because they were mine now. Mine to keep. Mine to decide what to do with. I ran my fingers along the handle of the teapot, remembering how small my hands had once been when I used to pour invisible tea into chipped porcelain cups while Marissa and I played pretend. She had always liked being the queen. I think, for once, I was finally okay with being the one who walked away from the crown. You would think that walking away would bring closure. That making a choice to stand up, collect your pride, and leave behind the people who diminish you would immediately feel empowering. But here's what no one tells you about that moment of strength. Sometimes, it echoes with loneliness before it settles into clarity. 3 days after the wedding, I sat in the corner booth of a coffee shop downtown, the one with the plants that always seemed one watering away from death, and a playlist full of acoustic covers that never quite fit the mood. I was sipping a lukewarm oat milk latte I hadn't asked for, wrong order, again, but didn't send it back, because I didn't have the energy to correct anyone else that week. I was halfway through drafting an email to cancel my RSVP for the post-wedding family dinner when Melanie slid into the seat across from me, uninvited, holding a croissant in one hand and a face full of hesitation. "Don't yell," she said before I could even greet her. I know I should have called, but I figured if I showed up in person, you couldn't ignore me. I raised an eyebrow, but didn't argue. I didn't have the energy for a fight, but I also wasn't in the mood for sugar-coated guilt. Melanie, to her credit, got straight to the point. "So, everyone's talking about it," she said, unwrapping the pastry like it was the opening act of something important. "You leaving? The gift. Marissa's little tantrum afterward. You kind of set the place on fire without even raising your voice." I looked out the window, watching a dog strain against its leash, determined to chase something no one else could see. It felt familiar. "I didn't set anything on fire," I said, my voice even. "I just refused to keep pretending I wasn't being burned." She paused mid-chew, nodding slowly, swallowing her bite before responding. "I get that. I really do. And I don't blame you for leaving. Honestly, it was brave. But now the family's spiraling. Mom's crying to everyone about how you ruined the happiest day of her daughter's life, and Marissa, well, she's not exactly winning any sympathy awards. Why not?" I asked, my tone flat, though a small flicker of curiosity lit up inside me. Melanie leaned in, like she was about to reveal a secret she hadn't yet decided was hers to share. Because Aunt Jo told everyone what she saw. You, by the coats. That ridiculous smirk Marissa gave you. The fact that she assigned her only sister to stand during her wedding like a forgotten cousin instead of, I don't know, a person with actual significance. Her words hung in the air, sharper than I expected. I had assumed, wrongly, that my quiet exit had faded into the background of wedding toasts and first dances. I thought I'd slipped out like a shadow, unnoticed and unmissed. But apparently, I'd become the ghost of the celebration, haunting it not with noise, but with absence. People noticed, Melanie continued, lowering her voice. And not just the family. Even some of the groom's guests asked questions. One of his cousins thought you were an ex or something, the way you disappeared with that gift box. I winced at that. The idea of strangers reducing me to a character in a messy romance subplot was somehow worse than being dismissed entirely. And now what? I asked, folding my hands around the mug, its ceramic warmth the only comfort I could claim in that moment. What happens next? Do I go to this dinner and pretend none of it happened? Do I smile and hand over the gift like some Hallmark redemption arc where the sisters hug over mimosas and call it even? Melanie's face softened in a way that reminded me of the girl she used to be before family dynamics and passive-aggressive Christmas cards made everything complicated. No, she said simply. You don't owe them that. But you do owe yourself some peace. Whatever that looks like. Later that evening, I sat in my apartment, lights dimmed, the tea set still sitting on my dining room shelf like an heirloom and a question mark at the same time. I thought about peace, not the kind people preach in therapy sessions and self-help books, but the kind that comes when you stop performing, when you stop holding your breath around people who only like the quiet version of you. And I realized that maybe peace wasn't about keeping everyone comfortable. Maybe it was about finally making yourself the priority after years of being a prop in someone else's show. When the night of the dinner came, I didn't go. Instead, I sent Marissa a message, not long, not emotional, just enough to make things clear. I know why you put me by the coat racks. I know it wasn't an accident. I'm done pretending we're something we're not. No response. Not that night. Not the next. Silence from a sister who once screamed the loudest when she didn't get her way. But then, 2 days later, an email. Not a text. Not a phone call. An email, like she needed to put distance between her and the feelings she didn't know how to name. Isabel. You embarrassed me. That's the truth. You made everything about you when it was supposed to be about me. But maybe I pushed you too far. I didn't expect you to actually leave. I thought you'd laugh it off like always. That's what you've always done, been the one who makes things easier. I don't know if I'm sorry. But I know you leaving ruined something. Not the wedding. But something between us. Marissa. I read the message 3 times. Not because it was touching, but because it was so brutally honest in its selfishness. There was no apology, no real acknowledgement of hurt. But there was something else a crack. A tiny fracture in her perfect world, a place where maybe she had to sit with herself and ask why her sister, the one who always showed up, finally chose to walk away. And maybe, just maybe, that crack was the beginning of something real. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes not from overwork or lack of sleep, but from spending too many years translating your own silence into someone else's comfort. That was the kind of tired I felt in the days after Marissa's email. The kind that seeps into your bones and makes every memory feel like it's wrapped in fog, even the ones that used to shine with clarity. Her email sat unread in my inbox for a full day after I first opened it. I didn't know if I was waiting for her to send a follow-up or for myself to find the right words. But mostly, I think I was letting the weight of it settle, this unspoken understanding that our relationship had always been built on uneven ground, and now the foundation had finally cracked wide open. I didn't reply. Not because I had nothing to say, but because I wasn't sure Marissa was ready to hear the truth if it didn't come wrapped in a ribbon of forgiveness. Instead, I went to the attic. That might seem like a strange thing to do in the middle of an emotional reckoning, but I've always found that memories hide best in boxes, stacked, taped shut, and labeled in handwriting that belong to versions of ourselves we barely recognize. My attic wasn't large, but it was cluttered with the artifacts of a life lived mostly in the background. Old notebooks filled with half-started stories. Photos from college where my smile never quite reached my eyes. Birthday cards from Marissa, always signed with love, but never layered with sincerity. And in the far back corner, beneath a fraying quilt my grandmother had made when I was 10, I found the box I didn't know I had been looking for. It was the wedding box. Not hers, mine. Years ago, before life got complicated and distance turned into detachment, Marissa and I had talked about our dream weddings while sitting on our childhood bedroom floor. We had planned every detail with the kind of naivety only teenage girls possess: champagne linens, peony bouquets, songs that made us cry long before we understood why. I had kept a box filled with magazine clippings, printed Pinterest boards, fabric swatches, and even a hand-sketched layout of a reception under fairy lights. At the top of the pile sat a folded letter in Marissa's handwriting, addressed to my future maid of honor. The paper had yellowed slightly, and the ink had faded just enough to make the words feel like they came from another life. But as I unfolded it, I could still read every line. Isabel, when I get married someday, I want you right beside me. You've always been the strong one, even when I pretend not to notice. I know I can be dramatic and selfish, but I never stop needing you. I hope you'll still want to stand with me, no matter how far life takes us. Love. Marissa. My eyes stung, not because I missed her, but because I missed the version of us who had written that letter. I missed the version of me who believed it. I didn't know what had changed. Maybe it was slow and unspoken. Maybe it happened when she moved away and started building a life that had less and less room for me. Or maybe it started even earlier, when we were both still under the same roof, but already drifting into separate orbits, quietly deciding who we needed to be to get the attention we craved. Whatever the reason, the truth was undeniable. The sister who wrote that letter was no longer the woman who had pointed me toward the coat racks without a second thought. Still, I kept the letter. I placed it in a new envelope and wrote the date on the front in soft pencil, a quiet act of witness to everything that had come before. The next day, I did something unexpected, even to myself. I texted her. Not ready to respond to your email yet, but I found something you wrote a long time ago. I think you forgot who you were. She didn't respond for hours, and when she did, it was short. Maybe I did. That was it. No apology. No elaboration. Just an admission that was both infuriating and strangely hopeful. That night, I dreamt we were little girls again, playing dress-up in our mother's closet. Marissa wore a floppy sun hat with fake pearls and called herself Queen of the Castle. I wore one of Dad's oversized jackets and pretended to be the castle guard. Even in our games, I was the one who stood outside, watching the door while she held court. I woke up feeling more tired than before. In the days that followed, the silence stretched between us like a taut wire. Not quite broken, but humming with tension. Then came a text from my aunt, Aunt Jo, the one who had always watched the family's messes like a silent referee. I think she wants to make things right, but I'm not sure she knows how. It made me wonder, what does making things right even look like when the damage isn't a single event, but a slow erosion over years of miscommunication, jealousy, and buried pain? I knew what I needed. Not a dramatic apology or a perfectly worded explanation. I needed to be seen. I needed her to acknowledge, for the first time, what it had cost me to keep showing up when I wasn't being invited into the room. So I made a list. Not for her, at least not yet. For me. A list of everything I had done in the name of sisterhood. The birthday parties I'd planned. The calls I had made at midnight when she didn't want to be alone. The times I had bitten my tongue because I knew she needed the spotlight more than she needed honesty. And then I added one final line at the bottom. And the moment I chose myself instead of waiting for you to choose me, that was the part she hadn't seen yet. But someday, maybe, she would. Grief is not reserved only for death, though people rarely talk about that. Sometimes, the deepest kind of mourning comes when you finally accept that someone who is still living, still present in the world, cannot show up for you in the way you always hoped they would. That realization sits heavy in your chest like wet wool, warm but suffocating, and impossible to wring out in a single night of crying or one carefully worded confrontation. In the weeks that followed the wedding, life didn't slow down just because my heart felt like it had been twisted sideways. Deadlines still loomed, groceries still needed buying, laundry still demanded folding. And yet, in the background of every ordinary task, I carried the ache of something unresolved, like a pebble in my shoe I refused to remove. I wasn't sure whether I was punishing myself with the silence between us or protecting what little dignity I had left. Maybe both. Marissa never sent another email. She didn't follow up. She didn't call. Instead, her social media bloomed with curated honeymoon photos, sun-drenched beaches, cocktails and coconuts, grainy selfies of her in mirrored sunglasses beside a man who looked almost surprised to be smiling that widely. The captions were all vaguely romantic with a hint of smugness, and though I tried to scroll past them without emotion, a small part of me felt something sharp settle in my throat each time I saw her name. What hurt most wasn't the trip or the love or the joy, those things on their own I could celebrate for her. What hurt was that she was able to compartmentalize what had happened so thoroughly that she could post about paradise while pretending the wreckage she left behind didn't exist. There was no trace of the sister she had publicly humiliated. No acknowledgement. Not even a subtle quote that hinted at growth or guilt. It was as if I had simply been cut from the frame. One night, nearly 4 weeks after the wedding, I got a call from Aunt Jo again. She didn't waste time on pleasantries. She invited me over for coffee, she said, her voice low, the way someone speaks when they're holding a secret they aren't sure is theirs to keep. And she brought you up. Finally. I sat down on the edge of my bed, unsure whether I wanted to hear the rest. She said she doesn't know how to fix it. She said she didn't realize how far apart you two had drifted until she saw your face that day. Until she saw you walk out with that gift like it was a piece of your childhood she didn't deserve anymore. I said nothing. I didn't know how to answer someone else's interpretation of my pain. Jo continued, gentler now. She told me about a letter you found. One she wrote when you were girls. That surprised her, I think. That you'd kept it. I felt my chest tighten. That letter had been my breadcrumb trail back to a version of us that might have existed once, buried under years of resentment and competition. But it wasn't a roadmap. It didn't offer direction, only proof that we had once known how to care for each other before life got in the way. She asked me if I thought you'd ever forgive her, Jo said. And I told her that forgiveness isn't a vending machine. You don't just put in guilt and expect redemption to pop out. I smiled at that in spite of myself. Aunt Jo always did have a way with metaphors that felt both too honest and just right. She wants to meet, Jo added after a beat. Just you and her. No audience. No dramatics. Somewhere neutral. She says she doesn't expect anything except the chance to sit with you and not pretend anymore. I didn't give an answer that night. I went to sleep with Jo's words swimming in my head, twisting into dreams where Marissa and I sat across from each other in places that kept changing: our childhood bedroom, a church pew, an empty theater. In every dream, she tried to speak, but no sound came out. And I just sat there, waiting, heart pounding, wondering if this time would be different. The following morning, I texted Jo 2 words. I'll go. We met the next Sunday at a quiet cafe tucked between 2 bookstores downtown. It was the kind of place with vintage postcards tacked to the walls and mismatched mugs that made you feel like nothing needed to be polished to be worthy of display. I arrived first and took the table by the window, my hands wrapped around a steaming cup of chamomile I wasn't drinking. She arrived 7 minutes late, looking nervous in a way I had never seen before. Her eyes darted toward mine, as if asking permission to sit. I nodded, and she eased into the chair. Neither of us spoke for a long moment. The silence felt almost ceremonial, like the air had to settle before words would be allowed to enter. I don't know how to start, she said eventually, fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup. I've gone over it 1,000 times in my head, and nothing sounds like enough. I stayed quiet. I wanted to give her space. I wanted to see if she'd fill it with truth. I know what I did, she continued, her voice cracking slightly. I know what it looked like, what it felt like. And I know you probably think I did it because I don't care about you. But that's not it. It never was. I was angry. The word hung there between us, raw and unpolished. Angry? I finally asked, my voice low but steady. At me. She looked up, her eyes glassy. Not at you. At myself. At how easy you make it look to be alone. At how strong you are, and how I've spent my whole life needing to be chosen, needing to be seen. I thought putting you at the edge would make me feel centered. But all it did was prove how off balance I really am. I blinked, unsure how to respond. Her words weren't an apology, exactly. But they weren't excuses either. They were messy and tangled and, for once, real. We talked for over an hour. Not everything was resolved. Not every wound was closed. But somewhere in the middle of our conversation, I realized something important. Forgiveness doesn't always come like a thunderclap or a sweeping gesture. Sometimes it arrives like this, a quiet meeting between two women who used to be sisters in more than name, sitting across from each other, learning how to speak without armor. In the weeks that followed that cafe meeting, something shifted between us, not dramatically, not overnight, but slowly, like the changing of a tide. There were no declarations, no grand resolutions, no tearful sisterly reunions that wrapped everything up in a perfect vow. But there was effort. And for us, effort was everything. It was more than we'd given each other in years. We started with small things, text messages that didn't feel obligatory, photos of our lunches with sarcastic commentary, even the occasional late-night voice note that began with, "You'll never believe what just happened." At first, I braced for the backslide. I expected her to retreat into old habits, to reach for the easy comfort of denial or defensiveness. I waited for the moment when I would feel that sharp sting of exclusion again, the one that had hollowed me out at her wedding and made me walk away holding a gift that was never really meant for her, at least not anymore. But that moment didn't come. Instead, she kept showing up, not perfectly, not always gracefully, but consistently. About a month after the cafe, she invited me over for dinner. This time, there was no crowd, no extended family, no backdrop of performance. Just the two of us and a small round table in the apartment she now shared with her new husband, Daniel. He wasn't home that night, intentionally, she said. She wanted us to have space. I appreciated that, though I didn't say it aloud. There were still things between us that felt too fragile to name. She cooked, which surprised me, because she rarely had before. It wasn't elaborate, some kind of roasted vegetable pasta, garlic bread slightly overdone, a bottle of wine she admitted was chosen solely for the label. But there was something in the way she moved through the kitchen, the quiet deliberateness of her actions, that told me she was trying. And trying, in our case, meant more than any apology ever could. We sat down at the table and, for a few minutes, the only sound was the clink of forks and the quiet hum of whatever playlist she had going in the background. It felt strange to be there, in her space, without the usual weight of competition pressing against us. We had spent so much of our lives shadowboxing, jabbing at each other in ways that looked harmless, but always left bruises. "I've been thinking," she said, breaking the silence, her voice tentative, but not afraid. "About that letter. The one you found." I looked up, surprised. I hadn't brought it up since that first conversation. I wasn't even sure she believed I had truly kept it all these years. "I wrote that when I still believed we'd never grow apart," she said, pushing a piece of zucchini around her plate. "When I thought nothing could come between us because we shared a room and matching hair clips and the same hatred of gym class." I laughed at that genuinely, for the first time in what felt like months. We had been inseparable once, so fused together in childhood that it hadn't occurred to either of us we could ever be anything else. Sisters by blood, yes, but also by choice, or at least that's how it used to feel. "I kept it because it reminded me of who we were," I said softly, meeting her eyes. "And maybe of who I still wanted us to be." She nodded, swallowing hard. "I lost sight of that somewhere along the way. I think I started believing that needing you made me weaker. and then resenting you because you didn't seem to need me at all. That landed like a small stone in my chest, not heavy, but undeniable. I had always prided myself on being self-sufficient. I had built an entire identity around not asking for help, not burdening anyone, especially not her. Maybe in my silence, she had seen abandonment. Maybe in her cruelty, I had seen rejection. And in between those misinterpretations, we had let years unravel like a thread no one bothered to stop tugging. You know, I said after a moment, I didn't need you. I just didn't know how to say it without sounding weak. She blinked, startled, and for a second I thought she might cry. But instead, she reached across the table and laid her hand over mine, warm and trembling slightly. "I'm sorry for what I said to you that day," she whispered. "I'm sorry for making you feel small. You weren't. You never were. I just couldn't see past myself." I nodded, unsure whether the ache in my throat was relief or sorrow. Maybe both. Maybe always both, when it comes to the people who know your history so well they can rewrite it without even trying. After dinner, we sat on her balcony with mismatched mugs of tea, the city stretching out below us in amber lights and soft noise. There was a kind of stillness in the air that reminded me of sleepovers when we were little, those final moments before drifting off, when the world went quiet and secrets felt safe enough to share. "I've been thinking," I said, cradling my mug, "about what forgiveness really looks like." She turned toward me, her expression unreadable. "I don't think it means pretending nothing happened," I continued, "or acting like the hurt didn't matter. I think it just means letting the pain take up a little less space, making room for something else." She nodded slowly. Like trust." "Like trust," I echoed. "But rebuilt. Not assumed." We sat like that for a long time, saying nothing more. And in the silence, something fragile and tentative began to settle between us. Not a complete repair. Not a final chapter. But the beginning of something new. A middle ground where neither of us had to perform. A place where we could sit at the same table, see each other fully, and choose, deliberately, to stay. That night, as I drove home with the windows slightly down and the cool breeze brushing against my face, I realized something I hadn't been able to admit until now. The seat by the coat racks had never been about location. It had been about value. About visibility. And finally, I didn't need her, or anyone else, to place me at the right table.